Gold could make you rich, but in the medieval world, gold could not keep you alive. You cannot eat it. You cannot preserve food with it. You cannot survive winter on it. Salt, however, could do all three. For medieval societies, salt was not a seasoning or a luxury. It was a boundary between survival and collapse. Towns rose around it. Wars were fought over it. Governments taxed it, guarded it, and feared losing control of it. And yet today, salt is so ordinary that its power is almost invisible. To understand why medieval salt was often more valuable than gold, you first have to understand how fragile life was without it, and how quickly everything fell apart when food could not be preserved. Before refrigeration, food did not wait patiently to be eaten. It decayed. Once an animal was slaughtered, the race against time began immediately. Meat that was safe in the morning could be dangerous within days. Fish spoiled even faster. Milk turned within hours. Bread hardened. Vegetables rotted quietly in storage. Food did not disappear suddenly. It failed gradually and then all at once. For medieval families, this was not an abstract problem. It shaped daily decisions. When to slaughter, how much to cook, what to risk saving, what to consume immediately. Every choice carried consequences that would only become clear weeks later. A single warm spell could undo months of preparation. A damp cellar could ruin an entire winter's supply. A delayed harvest could turn abundance into scarcity before cold weather even arrived. There were no safety nets, no rapid imports, no emergency reserves, no external system to replace what had been lost. When food spoiled, it was gone. This made medieval food security intensely fragile. Households lived close to the edge, not because they lacked effort or knowledge, but because time itself worked against them. Abundance meant nothing if it could not be carried forward. What mattered was not how much food existed in a moment, but how long it could be kept from vanishing. Winter magnified this pressure. Once cold set in, fresh food all but disappeared. Fields lay dormant. Animals produced less. Travel slowed. What remained was whatever had been preserved earlier in the year. If that preservation failed, hunger did not arrive immediately. It arrived later, when options were already gone. This delay made failure more dangerous. A family might believe they were secure, only to discover weeks later that supplies were not lasting as long as expected. By the time spoilage became obvious, there was little left to do but ration and wait. This uncertainty shaped medieval life more than wealth ever could. People did not ask whether food was plentiful, they asked whether it would last. For centuries, medieval societies searched for ways to slow decay without stopping life entirely. They needed a method that did not freeze food in time, but allowed it to endure change without collapsing. Only one resource consistently made that possible: salt. Not as preference, not as flavor, but as the difference between food that vanished and food that endured. And once salt entered daily life, survival stopped being a gamble and began to resemble a system. Salt did more than preserve individual meals. It reorganized survival itself. Once food could be preserved reliably, time stopped being an immediate enemy. Meat no longer had to be consumed at once. Fish could be processed in bulk instead of eaten or discarded the same day. Dairy could be transformed into foods that outlasted the season they came from. This changed how people planned their lives. Survival was no longer judged day by day. It became seasonal. Families thought in months instead of meals. Decisions made in summer determined whether winter would be endured or feared. Salting season mattered. Animals were slaughtered at specific times not just for yield, but for preservation. Fish were processed immediately after being caught because delay meant loss. Salt had to be available at the right moment. Too early and it was wasted. Too late and food was already failing. There was no margin for timing errors. A successful preservation season created stability that lasted months. A failed one did not cause hunger immediately. It created vulnerability that surfaced later when options were already exhausted. This delay was dangerous. It allowed false confidence. Supplies appeared adequate at first. Stores looked full. But slowly food failed sooner than expected. Rations tightened. Anxiety rose. By the time scarcity was visible, there was nothing left to correct. Salt turned survival into a system, but systems only worked when inputs remained steady, and systems scale. As towns grew, fewer people produced their own food. Urban populations depended on preserved goods arriving from outside. Markets functioned because food could survive the journey. Trade existed because decay could be slowed long enough for exchange to occur. Travel relied on this stability. Journeys that once required constant foraging became predictable. Salted provisions allowed travelers to move farther without stopping. Routes expanded not because terrain improved, but because food could now endure the distance. Armies depended on this more than anyone. A marching army could not rely on fresh supplies. Hunting slowed movement. Foraging failed in winter and alienated local populations. Without preserved food, campaigns collapsed quickly. Salted provisions changed this calculus. An army with reliable salt access could move farther, remain deployed longer, and survive uncertainty. An army without it became vulnerable to delay, weather, and disruption. This gave salt strategic importance. But strategy introduced dependence. Preservation only worked as long as salt remained available. When access faltered, failure did not announce itself immediately. Food still existed. Supplies still appeared intact, but the system's tolerance shrank. Salt preserved not just food, but margin for error. When that margin disappeared, consequences followed weeks later, not instantly. Hunger arrived late and hit harder. Recovery became impossible because the season for preparation had already passed. This made salt both stabilizing and unforgiving. It allowed societies to plan ahead, and it punished them when planning failed. What began as a household tool quietly became a foundation for communities, travel, and warfare. And beneath all of it, another dependency was forming, because preserving food over time was not enough if the people consuming it could not remain strong enough to work, move, and endure. That dependency lived inside the human body. Salt mattered even when food existed. Medieval life demanded constant physical effort. Farming required long days of repetitive labor. Construction meant hauling stone and timber by hand. Travel happened on foot or horseback, often over difficult terrain. Warfare demanded endurance under stress, heat, and fear. This was a world powered by human bodies. Sweat was unavoidable, and with sweat came loss. Without steady salt intake, the body weakened quietly. Strength faded first. Fatigue followed. Muscles cramped. Recovery slowed. Illness became harder to survive. Even when food was available, the body struggled to use it effectively without balance. Medieval people did not understand chemistry or electrolytes, but they understood the pattern. A farmer without enough salt could not work as long in the fields. Harvests took longer. Mistakes increased. Crops were lost not to drought or war, but to exhaustion. A soldier without salt weakened before battle began. Marches shortened. Equipment felt heavier. Injuries healed poorly. Armies slowed not because they were defeated, but because their bodies failed to keep pace. Travelers felt this loss most directly. Long journeys drained the body quickly. Without salt, dizziness and collapse became real dangers. A traveler who could not maintain strength became a burden, then a casualty. Routes that looked viable on maps became lethal without adequate provisions. Salt determined whether effort translated into outcome. This effect was subtle, not dramatic. Communities did not collapse overnight when salt was scarce. Instead, productivity declined gradually. Workdays shortened. Projects stalled. Defenses weakened. What should have been built, repaired, or harvested simply took longer or failed entirely. This gradual erosion made salt shortages difficult to recognize at first. Food still existed, markets still operated, but output shrank. Labor efficiency fell. Resilience weakened. By the time hunger became visible, the damage was already done. Salt did not only preserve food for future consumption, it preserved the ability to function in the present, and this dependency was collective. When salt supplies were disrupted, Entire communities felt the effects physically before they felt them economically. Bodies weakened first. Production followed. Stability faltered. Salt's absence did not announce itself loudly. It whispered. And whispers are more dangerous than alarms because they delay response. This is where salt's role changed fundamentally, because once a society depends on a resource not only to eat, but to work, travel, and defend itself, control over that resource stops being a matter of convenience. It becomes a matter of power. Once salt became essential to survival and human function, it stopped being just a resource. It became leverage. Access to salt determined who could eat through winter, who could work through summer, and who could move armies without collapse. In a medieval world built on fragile systems, anything this critical could not remain neutral for long. Control followed dependence. Salt was not evenly distributed. Some regions had coastal access, salt marshes, or mines. Others had none at all. Entire towns and inland kingdoms depended on long-exposed supply chains simply to meet basic needs. Geography stopped being background. It became destiny. This imbalance reshaped power. Salt roads emerged not as conveniences, but as necessities. They were carved deliberately to move salt inland, often at great cost and risk. These routes functioned like arteries. When they flowed, cities lived. When they were disrupted, cities weakened quietly at first, and then suddenly. States noticed. Salt production and movement became regulated, taxed, and guarded. Rulers imposed monopolies. Licenses restricted who could transport salt and where. Weights were standardized, prices were set. Salt was counted, recorded, and watched. Not because it was luxurious, but because it was unavoidable. People could survive without gold. They could not survive without salt. That made salt taxation uniquely powerful. Demand did not fall during hardship. It increased. When times were worst, salt mattered most. This reliability made salt an ideal instrument of control. Salt taxes funded armies, roads, and administration. They stabilized treasuries, but they also concentrated authority. Whoever controlled salt controlled preservation, labor capacity, and military endurance at the same time. The effects reached daily life quickly. Salt prices influenced wages. In some regions, workers were paid partly in salt because it could not be substituted. When salt became expensive, labor suffered immediately. Food might exist, but bodies weakened. Productivity dropped. Resentment followed. Scarcity sharpened inequality. Those with access stockpiled. Those without rationed. Black markets formed where official supply failed. Smuggling became inevitable, not criminal by intent, but by necessity. Enforcement escalated as rulers tried to maintain control over a resource they could not afford to lose. Punishments were severe because the stakes were severe. Losing control of salt did not just mean losing revenue, it meant losing authority. A ruler who could not guarantee salt could not guarantee survival, and a population that could not survive would not remain loyal for long. This created feedback loops. Control increased pressure, pressure bred resistance, resistance disrupted supply, disruption intensified control. Each turn of the cycle raised tension without resolving the problem. Salt became political long before politics had formal language. Wars were influenced by salt access in ways that rarely appeared in chronicles. Territories with salt resources were defended fiercely. Coastal control mattered not only for trade, but for preservation. Cutting an enemy's salt supply was often more effective than defeating them directly. An army that lost access to salt did not need to be destroyed. It would collapse on its own. Campaigns shortened, marches slowed, morale weakened, equipment felt heavier, illness spread. What looked like strategic failure was often logistical suffocation. Salt shaped strategy quietly because logistics decide outcomes long before battles do. Power projection depended on logistics. Logistics depended on preserved food. Preserved food depended on salt. The chain was simple and unforgiving. This is where the scale truly shifts. Salt was no longer just about keeping food edible or bodies functional, it was about maintaining order, about sustaining authority through stress, about deciding who could endure disruption and who could not. Gold could symbolize power. Salt made power operational. And this distinction mattered most when systems were tested, because when access to salt failed, the consequences were not theoretical. They were immediate in the body, delayed in storage, and devastating in society. Gold has always captured attention. It shines, it stores value, it signals wealth and status. In the medieval world, gold could buy loyalty, fund armies, and display power. But gold had a limit. You could not eat it. You could not preserve food with it. And when winter arrived, gold could not keep you alive. Salt could. This is where the difference between symbolic value and practical value became impossible to ignore. Gold mattered in courts, treaties, and treasuries. Salt mattered in kitchens, storehouses, and supply lines. When food failed, gold lost relevance quickly. A hungry population could not be bribed with metal. Soldiers weakened by poor rations did not fight better because they were paid in gold. Towns without preserved food did not survive longer because they were wealthy. Salt determined whether wealth could be used at all. In times of stability, gold accumulated quietly. In times of crisis, salt decided outcomes. It allowed food to last, labor to continue, and armies to move. Without it, power stored regardless of how much gold existed on paper. This is why salt often commanded steady demand, while gold fluctuated. Gold could sit unused during hardship, salt could not. Its value was constant because its function was constant. People needed it whether times were good or bad. That made it more reliable than luxury and more dangerous to lose control over. Gold represented potential power. Salt represented active power. And the difference between the two became painfully clear when salt disappeared. Salt shortages did not arrive dramatically. They unfolded quietly. A disrupted trade route, a failed harvest of salt pans, a blocked road in winter. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Food still existed. Markets still functioned. But preservation margins shrank. Stored supplies did not last as long as expected. Weeks later, the consequences surfaced. Meat spoiled earlier. Fish could not be stored. Dairy failed faster. Laborers weakened. Armies shortened campaigns. Households consumed reserves sooner than planned. Then hunger followed. Without salt, food systems collapsed unevenly. Those with access survived longer. Those without suffered first. Smuggling increased. Hoarding followed. Punishment intensified as authorities tried to maintain control. Salt shortages exposed fragility. Cities weakened from the inside. Productivity fell before starvation appeared. Defense suffered before panic set in. By the time hunger became visible, systems were already failing. This is why salt loss was feared more than gold loss. Gold could be replaced eventually. Salt shortages triggered cascades. They shortened winters of endurance. They turned logistical problems into survival crises. And they revealed which societies were resilient and which were not. When salt vanished, the illusion of stability vanished with it. Salt rarely appears in stories of medieval power. It leaves no monuments. It inspires no legends. It does not glitter in vaults or crowns. And yet, it was one of the few things medieval societies could not function without. Gold represented wealth that could be stored, displayed, and admired. Salt represented survival that had to be maintained every day. One symbolized power, the other made power possible. This is the distinction we often miss. Civilizations are not held together by what looks impressive. They are held together by what keeps working when conditions turn hostile, when systems are stressed, when margins shrink, when failure arrives quietly instead of dramatically. Salt did not matter because it was rare. It mattered because it was unavoidable. It sat at the intersection of food, labor, movement, and authority. It determined whether abundance could be carried forward, whether bodies could endure effort, whether armies could move, and whether rulers could maintain order without constant force. When salt flowed, life felt stable. When it slowed, strength faded. When it disappeared, systems collapsed from the inside. And that is why medieval people valued salt more than gold. Not because they misunderstood wealth, but because they understood dependency. Gold could wait, salt could not. The medieval world was not sustained by treasure alone. It was sustained by ordinary resources performing extraordinary work, quietly and relentlessly, every day. Once you see that, it becomes harder to view history, or even the present, through the lens of spectacle alone. Because what truly shapes civilizations is rarely what shines. It is what endures.